There are stories we tell ourselves in the dark, and then there are stories we pray will stay buried in the dark. This one has been eating away at my conscience for decades now. I've spent countless nights trying to convince myself it was all just a product of an overactive imagination, just shadows playing tricks on my mind. But shadows don't leave evidence. Shadows don't haunt newspaper archives, and shadows certainly don't appear in century-old photographs, wearing the same face I'd come to know so well. You've probably heard the tale of John Henry, the steel-driving man who challenged a steam drill and won, giving his life in the process. It's a bedtime story, a folk song, a legend of American progress. I used to love that story too. Used to believe in its simple message of human triumph over machine. That was before I met the real John Henry, before I learned what really happened in those tunnels. Before I understood why some victories come at a price too terrible to imagine. I wouldn't be breaking my silence now if it weren't for those recent reports coming out of West Virginia. Those impossible discoveries in the abandoned mine shafts, the unexplainable readings, the disappearances. Reading those headlines, seeing those familiar patterns emerging again, it's like watching a nightmare slowly unfold for the second time. And I realize now that my silence isn't protecting anyone anymore. Some of you might have seen the viral photos circulating online, the ones from the newly uncovered tunnel complex dating back to 1887. They show something the experts can't explain, something that defies every natural law we know. But I can explain it, because I've seen it before. I've talked to it, shared coffee with it, listened to its stories during those long, dark nights at the museum. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another creepypasta or internet myth. Every word is true, though God knows I wish it wasn't. This is the story of my friend John Henry, not the legend, but the man. Or at least, what looked like a man. This is about the darkness that followed him, the price he paid for his famous victory, and the horrible truth I discovered about what really lies waiting in the deepest parts of those ancient mountains. And maybe, just maybe, by sharing this now, I can prevent history from repeating itself. Because the patterns are starting again, and somewhere in those West Virginia hills a tall, lean man with old eyes and a scarred left hand is watching, waiting, just like he's done for over 100 years. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is the truth about the John Henry I knew. The summer of 1994 feels like another lifetime now. Those long, humid nights at the Blackwater Mining Museum, where the past seemed to seep from the very walls. I was 21, fresh out of my junior year studying local history, eager to spend my internship cataloguing artifacts from West Virginia's mining heritage. What I didn't know then was that some pieces of history refused to stay locked behind glass cases. The museum itself was a maze of shadows after sunset, row upon row of rusty equipment, tools worn smooth by hands long since turned to dust. Display cases filled with faded photographs of stern-faced men standing before mine entrances, their eyes somehow always finding yours no matter where you stood. The air was thick with the musty smell of old timber and coal dust that no amount of cleaning could ever fully remove. That's where I met John. He worked the night shift security, though worked might not be the right word. He moved through those dark corridors like he owned them, like the museum was an extension of himself. Tall and lean, with that kind of weathered face that could have been 40 or 60, you couldn't really tell. His hands told a different story, though. They were a map of calluses and old scars, the kind you only get from years of hard labor. But it was his eyes that really caught your attention. Deep set and dark, carrying the weight of something I couldn't name back then. We fell into an easy routine, sharing coffee during my late-night cataloguing sessions. He had this old thermos he'd always bring, dented and worn, with initials scratched into the bottom that didn't match his name. Family heirloom, he'd say with that quiet smile of his whenever I asked about him. The coffee was always perfectly hot, no matter how many hours had passed. John knew things about the mines that weren't in any of our records. The way he talked about them, it wasn't like reading from a history book. He described the feel of the tunnels, the way the earth shifts and groans miles below the surface, the specific pitch of a support beam about to give way. The mountain's alive, he'd tell me, staring into his coffee. It remembers everything we've taken from it. I'd sit there for hours, listening to his stories about the old mining days. He spoke about disasters from a century ago like he'd been there, describing details so vivid you could almost smell the coal dust in the air. At the time, I assumed he'd heard these stories from his father, or maybe his grandfather. That's what I told myself, anyway. It was easier than questioning why he sometimes slipped into present tense when talking about events from the 1880s. Looking back now, I should have noticed the way other employees avoided him, how the morning shift guards would leave before he arrived, how no one seemed to know exactly how long he'd been working there. But when you're young and fascinated by history, sometimes the strangest things can seem perfectly normal. Sometimes you don't realize you're talking to history itself until it's too late. Those early summer nights, with their endless conversations about the mines, were just the beginning. They were the calm before the descent, the quiet moments before I started noticing the impossible things about John Henry. Things that would shatter everything I thought I knew about reality, about history, about the price of progress, and about the deals men make in the dark. The night everything changed started like any other. I was alone in the archive room, sorting through boxes of yellowed documents and forgotten memories. The air was thick with that special kind of silence you only find in places where time seems to stand still. My flashlight beam caught something tucked away in the corner. A leather portfolio that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside were photographs from 1887, documenting the construction of the first major tunnel at the Blackwater mine. Standard historical documentation, or so I thought. The first few showed the usual scenes: proud foremen posing with their crews, surveyors with their equipment, miners gathered around the mouth of the newly carved tunnel. But then I found it. The photograph that would haunt my dreams for years to come. At first glance it seemed ordinary enough. Another group shot of miners standing before the tunnel entrance. The date was clear in the corner, August 15th, 1887. I was about to move on when something in the background caught my eye. There, half hidden in the shadows at the edge of the tunnel mouth, stood a figure that made my heart stop. I knew that lean frame, that distinctive stance. I knew that face. It was John. Not someone who looked like John, not an ancestor, not a coincidence of photography. It was him. The same sharp jawline, the same deep-set eyes, even that peculiar scar on his left hand that he'd never explained to me. The man in my 1887 photograph was, without a single doubt, the same man who'd been sharing coffee with me every night for the past 2 months. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the photograph. The rational part of my mind tried desperately to make sense of it. A family resemblance, maybe. A trick of the light. Anything but the impossible truth, staring back at me from across a century of time. I found John in his usual spot by the East Wing security desk. The photograph felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket as I approached him. When I finally worked up the courage to show it to him, his reaction turned my blood to ice. There was no surprise, no denial, no attempt to explain it away. Instead, he smiled, that same knowing smile I'd seen 100 times before, but now it seemed different, older, darker. "Some stories are better left in the dark, kid," he said, his eyes never leaving the photograph. The way he looked at it, not with shock or confusion, but with something that seemed almost like nostalgia. Then he added something that makes even less sense now than it did then. The mountain keeps its own record of things. I wanted to demand answers, to shake him until the truth came spilling out. But something in his expression stopped me. For the first time since I'd known him, I felt afraid. Not of John exactly, but of what his existence implied. Because if that really was him in the photograph, then everything I thought I knew about reality, about history, about time itself, was wrong. That night marked the beginning of my descent into a mystery that would consume my life. The photograph was just the first crack in the foundation of reality. The first hint that the story of John Henry, the steel-driving man, might be more than just a folk tale. It was a warning, wrapped in legend, passed down through generations. And I was beginning to understand why some warnings are written in blood and buried in the deep dark of forgotten mine shafts. After discovering that photograph, something changed in John. It was as if a dam had broken, letting loose a flood of darkness he'd been holding back all those years. His stories took on a different tone, darker and deeper, like the tunnels he described, the ones that went down farther than any mining shaft should go. Night after night, he'd tell me about places in the mountain that weren't on any map, tunnels that would appear on one survey and vanish from the next, passages that seemed to breathe, their walls pulsing with something that wasn't quite life as we know it. The deeper you go, he'd say, his voice dropping to barely a whisper, the more the mountain wants to keep you. He spoke of sounds that haunted the lowest levels, not the usual creaking of support beams or the distant rumble of earth settling. No, these were sounds that made veteran miners weep, sounds that couldn't exist in our world. The singing of metal against stone that echoed up through impossible depths, carrying notes that no human throat could produce. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, he'd talk about the voices that called from the void, promising everything a man could want, if only he'd keep digging deeper. That's when he started telling me about the contract. Not the famous contest between man and machine that everyone knows, the real story. The truth behind the legend of John Henry, the steel-driving man. His eyes would get distant, like he was seeing through the walls of the museum, through time itself, back to that fateful day in 1887 when he made his bargain. You see, kid, he told me one night, his coffee gone cold and forgotten, beating that steam drill was never about proving a man's worth. It was about feeding something hungry, something old, something that lives in the deep dark, watching us scurry around with our machines and our progress, waiting for someone desperate enough or proud enough to make a deal. The more he revealed, the more I understood why the legend of John Henry had survived all these years, passed down through generations of miners. It wasn't just a tall tale about human determination. It was a warning, wrapped in a story simple enough for children to remember, but deep enough to carry a terrible truth. Some victories come at a price that keeps being paid, generation after generation. John's voice would tremble when he described the thing he met in the deepest tunnel, the entity that offered him the strength to beat the steam drill. It wore darkness like a coat, he'd say, and its eyes showed you everything you ever wanted, everything you could become. All it asked for in return was a promise, to stay and watch, to witness what men would do to the mountain, year after year, decade after decade, to be the keeper of all the dark secrets we bury in holes we were never meant to dig. I started connecting his stories to old mining disasters, to mysterious disappearances, to unexplained collapses that had plagued the region for over a century. Each incident had its witnesses, its survivors who spoke of a tall, lean man who'd appeared just before tragedy struck, trying to warn them away. Some called him a guardian angel. But now I knew better. He wasn't there to save anyone. He was there because he had to be, bound by a contract older than the steam drill he'd beaten, forced to watch history repeat itself in an endless cycle of human hubris and underground darkness. The folk hero I'd grown up admiring, the symbol of human triumph over machine, was actually something far more tragic, an eternal witness, cursed to walk the tunnels until the mountain claimed its final due. And as I sat there night after night listening to his confession, I realized I too had become part of his story, another witness to a truth too terrifying to be forgotten. I found the recordings by accident. I'd been spending more and more time in the museum's basement, searching for anything that might help me understand what John truly was. Hidden behind decades of dust and forgotten paperwork, I discovered a wooden crate marked Oral Histories, Blackwater Mine, 1885 to 1889. Inside were dozens of wax cylinders, their surfaces etched with the voices of men long dead. The museum had an old phonograph in storage, a relic we'd never put on display because it still worked. My hands were shaking as I placed the first cylinder on it. The sound that crackled through the horn turned my blood to ice. These weren't the sanitized folk tales I'd grown up with. These were the raw, frightened voices of men who'd seen something they couldn't explain. February 12, 1886, a trembling voice began. Interview with Thomas McCullough, former pit boss at Blackwater Mine. The old miner's voice was thick with fear as he described his first encounter with John Henry. He came to us 3 days before the collapse of Tunnel 6, told us to evacuate, said the mountain was hungry. We thought he was just another drifter, but he knew things. Knew exactly where the support beams would fail. Knew the names of men who'd died in that shaft 40 years before I was born. When I asked him how he knew, he just smiled. But it weren't no normal smile. It was like he'd seen every disaster that was yet to come. Another cylinder, another voice, this one from 1887. He's always there, right before it happens, standing at the mouth of whichever tunnel's about to give way. Some of the men, they call him a guardian angel. But angels ain't supposed to look the same after 50 years of watching men die. Angels don't have eyes that glow like hot coal in the dark. The recordings went on, each one more disturbing than the last. A mining engineer from 1888 describing how John appeared in a photograph taken decades before his famous contest with the steam drill. A widow telling how her husband's last words were about a man who'd warned him about a collapse, a man whose description matched newspaper accounts from 1849. But it was the last recording that haunts me most. Dated November 1889, it contained the confession of a dying man named Samuel Whitaker. His voice was barely a whisper as he described what he'd seen the day of John Henry's legendary race. It wasn't just man against machine that day. There was something else down there in that tunnel, something ancient, something that spoke to John in words that made my ears bleed. I saw him sign it, not a contract on paper, but something written in the very rock itself. And when he won that race, when his hammer struck that final blow, I swear on my deathbed, it wasn't triumph I saw in his eyes, it was terror. As I sat there in that basement surrounded by the voices of the dead, everything began to make horrible sense. Every folk song about John Henry, every tale of his victory, they weren't celebrations. They were warnings, distorted by time and retelling into something safer, something easier to accept. But these recordings preserved the truth, captured in the frightened voices of men who'd glimpsed something our world wasn't meant to understand. These weren't just historical artifacts. They were a chronicle of something immortal, walking among us, bound by an ancient pact to witness humanity's endless invasion of places we were never meant to go. And now, as I listen to these same recordings all these years later, I realize they're also a preview of what's about to happen again. Once you start seeing the pattern, you can't unsee it. It's like a dark thread woven through the fabric of history, binding together events that should have been separated by decades. I spent weeks in libraries across 3 states, digging through newspaper archives, accident reports, personal diaries, anything I could find about mining disasters in the region. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I knew about time itself. Tunnel collapse, Big Creek Mine, 1892. A strange man appeared at the mine entrance 3 days before. Tall, lean build with a distinctive scar across his left palm. Warned the foreman about weak support beams in the north shaft. We didn't listen. Cave-in at Preston County Coal Works, 1907. Worker accounts mention a night watchman who kept to himself. Always seemed to know which tunnels were dangerous before anyone else. Left without a trace the day before the disaster. Description matches a man photographed at the same site in 1878. Blackwater mining accident, 1924. Several miners reported conversations with a man they called the Watcher. Spoke about the mountain like it was alive. Had eyes that seemed to hold centuries of sorrow. Matches descriptions from incidents dating back to the Civil War. The details were always the same quiet intensity in his eyes. The same calloused hands that seemed to know the mountain's secrets. The same way of speaking about the depths, not as empty spaces to be conquered, but as something ancient and aware. Even the words he used were identical across decades. The mountain remembers. Some depths weren't meant for men. The earth keeps its own time. I found him in mining town photographs spanning more than 100 years. Always in the background, always watching, never aging. Sometimes he'd appear as a worker, sometimes a foreman, sometimes just a drifter passing through. But the eyes were always the same. Those ancient, haunted eyes I'd come to know over coffee in the museum. What terrified me most wasn't just his presence throughout history. It was the mathematical precision of it. He didn't just appear randomly. There was a pattern to the disasters, a cruel geometry to the timing. Every major collapse, every tragic accident, every mysterious disappearance formed points on a map that, when connected, traced something that looked disturbingly like a signature carved across the Appalachian Mountains. The folk songs got it wrong. John Henry didn't die beating that steam drill. He'd earned something far worse than death that day, the burden of eternal witness. Cursed to walk these mountains forever, carrying the weight of every tragedy he couldn't prevent. Bound by some ancient contract to watch as humanity dug deeper and deeper into places we were never meant to go. And now, looking at recent geological surveys, at new mining permits being approved, at the patterns of subtle earth tremors that no one else seems to notice, I can see it happening again. The same signature is being carved into these mountains once more. History isn't just repeating. It's fulfilling a cycle that began the day a man named John Henry made a deal in the dark. That last night haunts me more than all the others combined. The storm had come out of nowhere, bringing darkness that seemed almost solid. Lightning turned the museum windows into mirrors, and thunder shook the old building's foundations until it felt like the whole place might collapse into whatever waited below. When the power went out, the darkness that filled those halls was different. Deeper somehow, as if the storm had torn a hole in reality itself. I found John in the mining exhibit, standing before the famous photograph of his legendary race. Lightning flashed, and for a moment his reflection in the glass looked wrong, ancient, like something wearing a man's shape. "It's time you knew the truth," he said, his voice carrying over the storm's fury. "About that day in 1887, about what really happened in that tunnel, about the price of beating that steam drill." He turned to face me, and in the storm's strobing light, his eyes held the darkness of 1,000 mine shafts. The story he told me that night wasn't the triumphant tale of man versus machine. It was a confession that made my soul grow cold. The contest had never been about proving human worth against industrial progress. It was about something far older, something that had been waiting in the deep dark since before the first human dared to break the Earth's surface. "You see," he said, "that steam drill wasn't just threatening our jobs. It was going to let them dig deeper than men were ever meant to go. Deep enough to wake something that should have stayed sleeping. Something that had been watching us, testing us, waiting for someone desperate enough or proud enough to make a bargain." Lightning crashed as he rolled up his sleeve, revealing his left arm. What I saw there wasn't just the scar I'd glimpsed before. It was a pattern of lines and symbols that seemed to move in the darkness, carved not just into his flesh but into reality itself. "The strength to beat that machine came with a price," he whispered. "An eternity of witnessing. Every disaster, every collapse, every time human pride drives us to dig where we don't belong. I have to be there. I have to watch. I have to remember." His voice cracked as he described the moment of his victory, not with pride, but with horror. "When that final blow struck, when my hammer broke through that last bit of rock, something broke in reality too. The thing I'd made my deal with, it showed me everything. Every mining disaster that would ever happen, every life that would be lost to human greed and progress. And I became bound to it all, chained to the cycle by my own damn pride." Thunder rattled the building's bones as he told me about the true nature of his immortality. Not a gift, but a curse. "Time doesn't flow right down there in the deep dark," he said. "The mountain, it remembers everything at once. Past, present, future, they're all the same in those depths. And now, so are they for me." The storm reached its peak as he finished his tale, and in one blinding flash of lightning I saw something behind him. A vast, impossible shape, like a tunnel mouth opened in reality itself. But this tunnel didn't lead into any mountain I knew. It led somewhere else, somewhere old, somewhere hungry. "They're starting to dig again," were his last words to me. "In places they shouldn't. The cycle's beginning again, and I have to be there. I have to watch. It's all I can do now. It's all I'll ever do." When the power finally came back on, John was gone. All that remained was his security badge on the desk, and beside it his ancient thermos, still somehow warm to the touch, still carrying coffee as black as the depths he was bound to witness for all eternity. Dawn broke over the mountains like a bruise that morning, the air still heavy with yesterday's storm. When I arrived at the museum, I already knew something was different. The building felt emptier somehow, as if something ancient had finally moved on, leaving behind only echoes and questions. John's security desk stood empty. His badge lay there, the metal strangely cold to the touch, next to a single piece of yellowed paper. The handwriting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Not old-fashioned exactly, but wrong somehow, as if each letter had been formed by someone who'd forgotten how writing was supposed to work. 5 words. The Earth needs its witnesses. I was still holding that note when the first reports came in. The oldest section of Blackwater Mine, sealed off since the 1880s, had collapsed during the night. But this wasn't just another cave-in. What they found beneath the rubble defied explanation. The collapse had revealed a network of tunnels that, by every law of geology and engineering, shouldn't have existed. I was there when the survey team made their initial assessment. Their instruments couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. These passages weren't dug by any human hand or machine. They branched and twisted in ways that violated our understanding of physical space. Some seemed to spiral endlessly downward, while others appeared to fold back on themselves in impossible geometries. The dating results nearly drove the geologists mad. The mineral formations in these tunnels suggested they were older than the mountain itself. Older than mountains should be able to exist. But that wasn't even the most disturbing discovery. Deep in one of the newly revealed chambers, they found tool marks in the rock. Perfect. Mechanical strikes that couldn't have been made by any mining equipment. Not now, not ever. I recognized those marks. They matched the description in every account of John Henry's legendary contest. But these weren't just in one section of tunnel. They were everywhere, spreading through the rock like veins in a living thing, as if something had been slowly carving its signature into the bones of the earth for over a century. The official reports tried to explain it all away. Industrial accidents, natural formations, faulty equipment readings. But I knew what we'd really found, evidence of the price John Henry paid. Every impossible tunnel was a path he'd been forced to witness. Every tool mark, a reminder of the deal he'd made. Every branching passage, another tragedy he'd been bound to observe. They sealed the mine again within a week. Too dangerous, they said. Too unstable. But I saw the fear in the surveyors' eyes. They'd felt what I'd felt down there. The sense that these tunnels weren't just spaces in the rock. They were more like scars, marking where something old and patient had been slowly testing the boundaries between its world and ours. That was the last anyone ever heard of John Henry, the Night Watchman. But it wasn't the end of John Henry, the witness. Because sometimes, late at night, in mining towns across Appalachia, people still see him. A tall, lean figure standing at the mouth of mines that are about to collapse, warning those who'll listen, watching those who won't, bearing witness to the price of progress, one disaster at a time. I hadn't planned to ever tell this story. For 3 decades, I've kept these memories locked away, trying to convince myself that time would somehow make them feel less real. But last week, I saw something that made my heart stop. A headline about new mining operations in West Virginia, accompanied by a photograph of the groundbreaking ceremony. And there, in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, a tall, lean figure with haunted eyes watching from the shadows. The patterns are impossible to ignore now. They're the same ones I spent years documenting. New mining permits are being approved in places that were marked as unstable a century ago. Geological surveys are showing anomalies that mirror the readings from 1887. And most terrifying of all, there are the whispers spreading through mining towns. Stories of a night watchman who appears at different sites, warning workers away from tunnels that collapse days later. The descriptions are always the same. A tall man with ancient eyes, a distinctive scar across his left palm, a way of talking about the mountain as if it were alive. Some say he appears in their security footage, but never in the same place twice. Others claim to have shared coffee with him during the night shift, saying he drinks from an old dented thermos and speaks about mining disasters from 100 years ago as if he'd been there. I've tracked the reports, mapped them against historical data. The pattern isn't just similar to what I discovered 30 years ago, it's identical. The same sequence of appearances, the same geological disturbances, the same strange tunnels being discovered during routine surveys, tunnels that seem to defy the very laws of nature. But there's something different this time, something worse. The mining companies are using new technology, machines that can dig deeper than anything we've ever used before. They're planning to breach depths that no human was ever meant to reach. And if what John told me that night in 1994 was true, if there really is something down there that's been waiting, testing, watching, then these new operations might finally wake it up. I see his face in every shadow now, in every newspaper photograph of mining operations, in every security camera still from sites across Appalachia. John Henry isn't just watching anymore. He's trying to warn us. Because this time, the cycle isn't just repeating, it's accelerating. The signatures carved into the mountains are growing larger, the impossible tunnels are spreading faster, and whatever made that ancient bargain with a proud steel driver is stirring in its sleep. That's why I'm breaking my silence now. Because somewhere out there, in the darkness of a mining tunnel or the shadows of a midnight shift, John Henry is still walking his eternal rounds, still bearing witness, still trying to warn those who'll listen about the price of pushing too far, too fast, too deep. And if we don't heed his warning this time, I fear we'll all become witnesses to something that should have stayed buried in the dark heart of the mountain. They'll tell you I'm just spinning tales, that I've twisted an American legend into something dark and unrecognizable, that there's a perfectly rational explanation for everything I've shared. Sometimes, in the harsh light of day, I almost believe them myself. Almost. But then night falls, and I remember the weight of that ancient thermos in my hands. I remember the impossible geometries of those buried tunnels. I remember the look in John's eyes when he showed me his scars. Not just the one on his palm, but the deeper ones carved into his soul by a century of watching human pride dig too deep. The old songs got it wrong. They tell us John Henry died with his hammer in his hand, a martyr to progress, a symbol of human determination. But death would have been a mercy compared to what really happened that day in 1887. Because some victories aren't victories at all. They're contracts written in bedrock and sealed with pride. Some champions don't get to rest in glory. They become eternal witnesses to the price of their triumph. Even now, as I write this, mining companies are breaking new ground across Appalachia. Their machines are bigger, their ambitions deeper, their hunger for what lies below greater than ever before. And somewhere in those mountains, a tall, lean figure watches and waits, bound by an ancient promise to bear witness to whatever comes next. So the next time you hear someone singing about John Henry, listen carefully to what the song's really trying to tell you. Pay attention to the parts they skip, the verses they've forgotten, the warnings hidden beneath the triumph. Because some legends aren't meant to inspire, they're meant to terrify. Some heroes aren't meant to be celebrated, they're meant to be remembered as cautionary tales. And sometimes, late at night, when you're driving past those mountain mines and you see a solitary figure standing in the shadows, remember this. Not all victories are worth their price. Not all challenges should be met. Not all depths should be plumbed. Because something is waiting down there in the dark, patient and hungry, testing us with every tunnel we dig, watching us through the ancient eyes of a man who learned too late that some battles aren't meant to be won. This is my testimony. This is my warning. This is the true story of John Henry. Not the hero of legend, but the eternal witness to human hubris. And somewhere out there, he's still walking his rounds, still watching, still warning, still bound to the earth by promises we were never meant to understand. Because some stories don't end. They just keep going deeper and deeper, like tunnels into the dark heart of the mountain, until they reach something that should have stayed buried forever.